Hello, everybody. I'm Matt Volm, CEO and founder of RevOps Co-op. We have a global community of 16,000 plus revenue operators from all over the globe. And today we are going to be talking all about how to close the strategy to execution gap. I think something that in RevOps we are all very familiar with, right? You put together these great plans, annual plans, quarterly plans, but when, rubber meets the road, right? Like that's where the hard part, executing is really, really hard. And there's a point A to point B. And to talk about this and how to close that strategy to execution gap, we've got a couple of CEOs who have a whole lot of experience in doing this. And so I have Werner Schmidt, who is the CEO and co-founder over at Lative, and I have Elay Cohen, who is the CEO and co-founder over at Saleshood. And so guys, before we dive into the topic of the day, I actually have a non-RevOps, non-work related question that I did not tell you that I was going to ask you. So this is going to be straight up off the cuff remarks. Werner, I'm going to ask you this question first because Eli's our guest and I want to give him at least a little bit more time to answer here. So as you know, and Werner, you're going to be at our conference in May, our RevOps AF conference in May, which is in New Orleans. We're going to have 300 to 350 people in RevOps there. I've seen ticket sales come through. We've got operators from companies like Zoom, Cisco, Boeing, and a bunch of other SMB mid-market companies as well that are going to be there. So you're going to be there. You are going to be speaking, but I want you to pretend that you're going to be the opening keynote speaker for RevOps AF in New Orleans in May. And we call your name. Naturally, 350 people in the audience. They all stand up. They're all cheering, Werner, Werner. What would be the walk-up song that you would play as you were entering stage left to deliver the opening keynote for RevOps AF?
Well, Matt, I think it's going to have to be the Cranberry Zombie. So learning from that from San Diego and the event that you held there last year in July, I couldn't be anything else.
That's right. That's a good choice. For those who weren't at our event last year, which was in San Diego, Werner got up on stage with Shantanu Shakar, who is the head of RevOps at Personio, and Daphne Costa-Lopez, who is the director of CS over at HubSpot. All of them live in Dublin, so they call themselves Irish Team, and they jammed out on the karaoke stage to Zombie by Cranberries. If you want to see Werner do more of that this year, RevOps AF, join us in New Orleans. We are obviously going to have a karaoke stage. So, Eli, I'm going to ask you the same question now. What would be your walk-up song if you were delivering the opening keynote at RevOps AF?
Matt, I love it. That's a great question. I ask people all the time, and when we do conferences, we also are very, very specific. I'm a DJ, right? So, and I got records here in my office. This is my walk-up song whenever I do keynotes. To answer your question, Christopher Cross, Ride Like the Wind, about 1:30 into the song where the thing is thumping and you can feel the wind in your hair. I want people to get that vibe so that way they really feel uplifted when we get started. So Ride Like the Wind, Christopher Cross. And there's a house version by Dimitri from Paris, which adds an extra little kick to it as well.
That's awesome. I love that. And of course, I should have known that you would have had the exact second to down time of like, I want to play it at like 1:31. That's when things get going. So that's great. Both very good choices. And now we'll go from Zombie and the Cranberries and Wind Blowing Through Your Hair to the topic today, which is closing the strategy to execution gap, specifically talking about the RevOps playbook for growth. So I do have a poll here that I'm going to launch. I just want to ask folks kind of where you're at, or at least what your role is in revenue execution, just to get a lay of the land, looking to see if folks are more on the ops side, enablement, if you're in leadership, maybe finance, CFO, or other. And so as we do that, and I'll give folks another 30 seconds to answer, I guess first, let's start talking a little bit, Werner, about why strategy to execution fails and maybe why it's so hard. Because I think logically, right, it's like, hey, we spend time on planning, we put a plan down on paper, right? And then you just like, you go and execute to the plan. It's like, what's so hard about that? But reality is that it's actually very, very hard. So why don't you get us started on that, Werner, and talk a little bit about why is it so hard and why does it often fail?
Yes. Well, thanks, Matt. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. Appreciate you all attending. And thank you, Eli, for being here as well. And especially on this topic, giving the experiences we've both had over the years. It is, if you think about it, there's an organization, right? There's lots of people, there's lots of moving parts. There's lots of data coming in and out. There's lots of decisions that need to be made every day, especially in the worlds we live in now. It moves fast. Things move fast. Things change fast. And you need to be able to adapt and change. But at the end of the day, we're all humans. And we need to work out what's the best way that we can all work together, put a plan together, and then execute. But it is, as you said, Matt, extremely hard to be able to do that, especially in a small organization or a larger organization. The principles are all the same. We're going to talk about 5 key pieces that I've certainly seen over the years of where it's gone very well and where it hasn't. These same 5 topics seem to be coming up to the top always when we think about why it doesn't. So we'll dig into that. But to really answer it is that at the end of the day, we're all humans. We all got to work together. We've got to find the best way to do that. And then we've got to figure out how do we make sure that we can execute it at the same time, being able to then change. And that's what makes it very hard.
Elay, what are your thoughts on that? Or maybe is it the same opinion that Werner mentioned? Like, why is the strategy to execution thing so hard? You've seen this a bunch in your life at Saleshood, prior lives at Salesforce and beyond.
Right. No, listen, everything that Werner said is correct. From my time at Salesforce to the last 12 years here at Saleshood, there are a lot of things that go wrong. There's executive alignment, systems, process, but it starts at the very beginning. If organizations, if teams aren't solving the right problem and they're not aligned around the specific problem, you end up spinning cycles and then you wonder a year later why you're still not hitting your goals. We get a lot of inbound from enablement practitioners, as you can imagine. Saleshood is a sales enablement platform. And we'll get enablement people, they'll show up and they'll raise their hand and they'll request a demo. We get on the demo call and my team tells me this. And they think they're solving a different problem than they are. And they'll say, oh, yes, we want to see a demo of your onboarding system. And we'll go, okay, tell us about, why do you want to see that? And through the conversation, it becomes apparent that they really don't have a ramping and an onboarding problem. What they really have is an execution problem, because they think they have an onboarding problem, but but when you dig into it, like Matt and Werner, they're actually not hiring any new hires. They have a lot of salespeople that are 12 months tenure, but they're just missing the mark on how they're executing deals. And so that's why I think it's so critical to really be crystal clear on the revenue problem that you need to solve. And then you want to kind of focus in on some of the leading indicators so you can really start getting your team aligned around how you can impact and make those baby steps toward executing the strategy that you're thinking about. That's just a story that's very real, happens to us 10 or 15 times a week.
Yeah, I remember actually back when I was the VP of BizOps at this company called Ally.io, which was OKR software, went on to get acquired by Microsoft and is now the Microsoft Viva Goals product. But when I was working at Ally, we would, kind of similar to what you mentioned, Elay, we had a lot of people that would come inbound and we would naturally start talking to them about their OKR process, how they ran things, what they were using today, right? Because the software will help you do those things better, more efficiently, more effectively. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, we're not really doing that today. We're not doing it at all. Or we're kind of doing it. Or like, I think I'm kind of doing it over here. And they expected like a product to like magically solve their problems. But if you don't have a grasp your problems first and kind of understand then how to approach solving them, then like you said, you wind up wasting cycles, spinning your wheels, wasting a lot of time on.
Let me give you another example, because I think, I've talked specifically right now about onboarding versus execution kind of metrics and KPIs that we should get teams aligned on. Another way to think about it is when you think about your buyer's journey or your sales process, I think a lot of organizations don't get real clear around where in the funnel they need to focus on. Front of the funnel, middle of the funnel, back of the funnel. And it becomes really hard when you've got RevOps, sales, marketing, enablement. You've got all these stakeholders and everyone's busy. Similar concept, but I just want to frame it in the context of the customer journey and asking the questions, because everyone wants to solve everything. Everyone always wants to solve every problem. But if you've got clarity around what your current capacity is, you've got clarity around what your metrics and KPIs are that are most important this quarter right now with a long-term view, and you prioritize, because we see so many organizations we're coming out of SCO season, right? And I've looked at a bunch of sales kickoff agendas and I'm like, why are people saying pipeline building and prospecting are the most critical thing that they got to solve, yet they're loading up people to talk about negotiating and closing skills. Like there's a mismatch there, Matt and Werner. So it all comes down to metrics and KPIs and just getting super clear.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, so Werner, on that, let's talk a little bit about maybe KPI and metric setting. And obviously, most people here are in ops, right? Or focused on go-to-market and revenue. So we can look at this through the revenue lens. When it comes to developing your strategy and those things that, you're putting down on paper, right? For your plan, I don't know, like what's the best way to approach setting the right KPIs or metrics? I even think about, you know, m- with measuring things, right? You kind of default to like what you can measure, which isn't necessarily what you should be measuring or what's easy to measure versus what you should be measuring. So, how should people think about KPIs and metric setting as it relates to the planning process to make sure that again, you're starting off on the right foot with how you're going to measure success?
Yeah, thanks, man. It's so interesting because it takes me back to two-story. One, I'm just thinking when I was at Citrix, right? We're looking at what metrics do we need to measure and how do we get aligned? Because as Elay pointed out, you've got different organizations and they operate a bit differently between sales, marketing, CS. Then we're thinking about go-to-market. And what we found is that as soon as you start to look at things that are a bit more difficult to calculate, like sales productivity and so forth, what's driving that, what's seeing that, but at a frequency that you can align it to some of the marketing metrics that are happening. So that, like Eli was pointing out there, the funnel, right? Being able to measure that funnel at each of the stages is really important. Now, to get to that is very hard. It is hard, but you need to have alignment. If you're not going to be aligned between what sales wants to measure and what marketing wants to measure and how those two fit together, which they do, one doesn't really exist without the other, it makes things very difficult and it makes the meetings very difficult when you're trying to understand where the problems actually are. So just my example back to Citrix, one of the things we learned back then was that you need to be in a room together. It can be a virtual room. And not necessarily in a room. Back then, it was actually in a room every Friday, getting sales and marketing leaders together in a room and agreeing what the KPIs were that we're going to measure. That can tell us what's going on, make any adjustments that needed to be made over the weekend, and then see what happened that next week. So again, each business the frequency is a bit different depending if you're high velocity or maybe more on the mid-market enterprise, which is a bit slower on deals closing. Once you have that alignment from those KPIs, what starts to then happen is you start to have executive alignment. And once you've got that executive alignment, now everyone's clear on what you focused on and everyone's clear on what those metrics are, of what you now need to do to increase those metrics or maybe decrease whatever the metric might be. And that leads me then into my next story is at Citrix, we got that to work and we grew that business unbelievably fast once that alignment was in place because everyone's clear on what we're doing, they're clear on what we're measuring. When we got to join Sage, what Sage was quite interesting is where there wasn't a lot of alignment at the start. And what my goal was right there was I spotted get executive alignment. Because once you get that executive alignment, we can then get the KPIs aligned with what we needed to do. And that actually starts leading into our third point about why strategy and execution tends to fail. It's just that lack of executive alignment, which then causes the problem with the KPIs because there's no alignment on the KPIs and it works its way back.
Yeah. Elay, I guess I'm curious. So you both are obviously CEOs. You're both building businesses, managing businesses, and obviously have a whole lot of things on your plate. So I can't imagine you are looking at 13 different dashboards, or maybe you are on a weekly basis. For the group here today, as we look at revenue, marketing, sales, post-sales, what are the handful of KPIs that you, Elay, as CEO of Saleshood, look at or care about on, say, a weekly, monthly basis?
Sure. Listen, I think it's different for every company, but I'll tell you my dashboard, which I review weekly with my leadership team. We set them at the beginning of every month and quarter. I do a weekly note out, sometimes a video, kind of reemphasizing what those metrics are. And it's super simple, right? We're looking at meetings or demo request, meetings booked, pipeline created. We're looking at new bookings, both for new business and add-on. We're looking at NPS. We're looking at what we call weekly engaged users and monthly active users. And then we're looking at pipeline and revenue that is impacting our customers' business. That's an adoption measure that we can have because of our platform. And then finally, I look at just a net income and then the cash flow, right?
Yeah.
And full stop.
Yep.
That's my scorecard. I've got it. It's how I lead my board meetings. It's how I lead my executive calls and critical, right? And then there's drill down on each of those, but I got to make sure that that's all lining up and that everything is trending in the right direction. And I've got my leading indicators as well to tell me if things are going sideways.
Yeah. So what's the best way for operators, knowing that those are the things that are important to you and managing, running your business? What's the best way to communicate with CEOs and folks at the executive level around those metrics and KPIs? We talked a little bit about like the executive alignment thing, but I think, a really big part of that is communication and how you tell stories, how you communicate with the C-suite folks at the executive level. So knowing now that like, hey, those are the things that are most important. What's the best way, or what advice do you have for people on how to best communicate with leaders at their company around metrics like that?
Right. I learned a lesson once. Mark Benioff called me into his office and he asked me a question and he said, "How are things going?" And I just kind of spewed off a bunch of detail. I was a product manager running a product line and in my early days at Salesforce. And he goes, "Stop." He goes, "Can you just tell me a couple stories? Give me some examples. I want to know what's working, what's not working, what teams are selling it, who's not selling it, what regions." And I got it. And so from that moment on, I was clear on a couple of specific metrics. So I think being clear and being concise and being consistent, even though a CEO or an executive may not respond, if you can consistently communicate how you're performing against metrics that you've already agreed upon with this executive are critical to your success and the company's success, and there's a direct line to one of those 10 metrics and KPIs that was top of mind for the business. However, the added pieces with a story, with an example. So that way they can touch the outcome. And that way, when they're in the region, they can talk about the results, but they want to tell stories as well. "Oh, this is the greatest product ever. And you know what? Like, we're hitting all of our numbers, but this one team in Chicago, Dan Deegan and his team, they're really crushing it. And here's what they're doing," right? That makes that executive, that CEO more authentic, and it's data driven and it's story driven.
100%. And yeah, like you said, it's something you can, one, just report out on results, all those things that you just mentioned that you have on your scorecard, right? Like someone can easily pull that information for you every single week, deliver those things, but the real value gets added when there's a story attached to that, because like you said, something you can touch, something you can feel, it makes it real. And so, Werner, we talked a little bit about some of the reasons why strategy to execution fails. We got into making sure you're solving for the right things, not the wrong challenges, making sure you're measuring the right KPIs. We talked about the lack of executive alignment. Also, a little bit on the making sure you have the right technologies, infrastructure in place, and just that you're scaling the right things, not automating bad processes. So let's get into now the how. If those are some of the challenges that we have, how can folks overcome some of those challenges? I'll leave it to you to pick what sort of bucket we start with, whether it's the alignment piece, the KPI piece, or get into the how.
Hey, Werner, do you want me to just tell a little bit about how I use kind of capacity planning and productivity to inform some of my metrics and KPIs for my board stuff?
Start there. While you do it, I'll post this to the group so they know they can see what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think that there was a question in the chat: what's harder, the metrics or the alignment? Alignment is clearly harder, but you do need the data. And so I'm fortunate, I've been working with Werner and Lative for a while. And so part of the info that we have is the reason why I've got clear metrics. Yeah, we use Salesforce and I can see what's closed. And yes, I'm using HubSpot. I can see the flow of pipeline and all that stuff. But to do the math on the capacity planning and the productivity per rep and use that to help inform kind of future planning, it really helps us overcome the challenges of where do I invest? Where is the business going? It kind of gives us a look from behind the last 30, 60, 90 days, the last few quarters. And it's important to have a system that way can look and then give you a glimpse into the future. So that way you can make decisions and ask more questions around what's working, what's not working. And so for that, I'm grateful. And Werner's helped us with that a little bit too. So Werner, I thought I'd just lead with that to give a real life example.
No, thanks, Elay. And that's what's super important because and it's one of the reasons why we create Lative. And I go back to, just thinking about that executive life is getting people aligned on the metrics and having that sort of single source of truth that you need. But it's also getting deep into understanding what is actually going on within the business. And that's why we land, when we built Lative, it was about sales productivity, right? What is the productivity of what the sales organization is doing today, and where is it coming from or not? Because that ultimately will tell you performance. It's not just about performance, but where's the business coming from a dimensional level, and then your decisions and all the questions you start to ask are different. And it starts to make you really, one thing I learned about his Citrix actually from a great product leader, Chris Battles, was about the 5 whys, right? Digging down into it. Why is this the problem? Right? And getting to the root cause analysis and being able to, and that's really powerful because, Matt, it goes back to this executive alignment, right? If the execs are aligned on what the problem is, it's much easier to then get the organization aligned on what you need to solve for. If they're not aligned and don't understand the data or can't tell the story to their board, things break down. And again, back to this whole topic we're talking about, why sometimes strategy, to execution fails. So I think it's aligning around those core metrics, making sure you can actually see them and calculate them on a frequent basis to then be able to deliver that up to the board. So you start asking the right questions so you can then solve
and telling the right story, and telling the story that's supported by the data, and then just providing some examples. I think very compelling.
Yeah, I know. On that storytelling piece and driving some of this executive alignment. I'll tell you what I think about this, and I'll be curious on your reaction in terms of how to drive some of that executive alignment. We talked about communication with the C-suite a little bit before, and the storytelling aspect tying in with the data aspect. But I know one of the things that I learned, or at least I guess 2 things about this that I approach when I'm interacting with like senior leaders or folks is, one, how can I tell that story that I want to get across in basically as few words as possible? And then 2, how can I basically shut up and leave room for silence? And I'm like, say what you want to say and then be quiet and leave room for that awkward silence that can be there, but embrace that, because that's how the person on the other side of the table can think. That's how they can then ask questions you can answer, right? That's ultimately what I've always tried to do. So I guess I'm curious on whether or not that would work with you guys, or if you have any other feedback or reactions on that.
Werner, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think the business that's operating with you there or not, and I think it's always something I've tried to do in the past, is that the team that you build together, or even in some of your companies, you might be the only one person in the role, especially when you think of RevOps and enablement in small organizations, is that it should be able to operate without you there. And Matt, to your point, people should be able to understand it and things are clear. This world of revenue operations and revenue management is highly complex. Every business is set up differently. There's so many things that you got to think about, and that's it. There's always problems to solve. And I think it's making sure that you can choose the right problems to solve, but that people can understand that. So Matt, to your example, when you leave the room, people should be clear on it and understand exactly what needs to be done. And, or if you weren't there, that things would continue and things aren't going to suddenly change, because then what was the point of all the work that you've just done for the last few months or whatever the time period might be?
Mm-hmm.
I remember a moment, listen, Werner was head of sales revenue enablement at Sage, and we were working with Sage at Saleshood, and Sage was a customer, and Werner and I were collaborating to help standardize on Saleshood at Sage, right? It's public information. There's nothing private about that, and I'm not confiding any confidentiality, right? And to your point, Matt, leaving space for an executive to digest and process the information. And I remember being in Atlanta with you, and we were meeting basically the executive sponsor, and Werner and I put together a presentation together. We're co-creating it because he's a champion, and I'm effectively kind of the quote unquote salesperson, but it was very strategic to us, and we were collaborating. It was fun. It was great. And we're in the room, and Werner and I had our own thoughts on impact and value and business case, and we had our own thoughts on all that. But this person, who had a seat at the table at the e-staff of the CEO, you know what? We put the slide up and we were quiet, and it was like this awkwardness for a few minutes in a good way. And he identified something that was not at the top of our list. And he said, you know what? The guided selling and the just-in-time content, inside Salesforce, in the workflow of the rep, like that is increasingly more important than these other 3 things that you're talking about. Let's nail that. And he goes, and you remember that moment, we're like, okay, let's focus on that. That's an example of giving an opportunity to share data and let the executive team, the stakeholders that you're working with, and you know what? They need time to process. And especially if you're not giving them the data ahead of time, you've got to ask an open-ended question like, okay, what do you think about this data, right? And don't ask a leading question like, do you agree? Bad question to ask, right? So how does this data map to your priorities, or whatever the question is, whatever the phrasing is, just something open-ended, something loose, not leading, and then just see what happens, because you'll be surprised what you'll learn. And it'll ultimately, again, back to the topic, it'll help you bridge the gap between strategy and execution, because you're not going to waste time building stuff, doing things that isn't top of mind for the executive you're speaking with, and ultimately the company and the CEO of the business.
I mean, you could have said, but and it was so true. I remember that moment, and I remember how, because of, and it was a big organization, of how important it was when you bring in new technology, and of how's that system going to fit into to it, and what's that then going to drive, and that all that thought process is going through his head, right? It's all followed by them. We can do this, but what about the rest of the organization? Because a lot of the time, and that's why we're so big on this executive alignment, they've got broader visibility to what we may see or what you might be privy to. And therefore, it's so important to have that person on board. And, like you said, right, we landed in a place we knew about, but we didn't think the prioritization of that was as high as maybe some of the other issues that we wanted to focus on, like onboarding, rolling our tails forward.
Right, back to onboarding. I told at the beginning.
Exactly, same thing, right? Was, well, we got all these reps that are changing, let's focus on onboarding, but that wasn't the problem we were solving for. And and it really changed things. I mean, if you think about where we spent 4 or 5 years focusing very carefully on this operational and enablement piece and bringing these two worlds together. I'm not saying all the success is down to that of what Sage has now done, because it's pretty remarkable where Sage is now from where it was, but it played a big piece in putting the right technologies in place, being able to understand that, but also how the systems then speak to each other and talk to each other. And that's really starting to where you start to get to integrate this revenue operations and revenue enablement worlds, because they are very tightly aligned. We might see them as two different pieces, but it's one of the reasons when we bought Lative is to produce all this information so that both it's not just the revenue operations teams, but the revenue enablement teams can make better decisions from it. I always think of revenue operations as being, very much keeping the lights on, which we have. As RevOps, you're so in, any problem that happens in the business seems to just come at RevOps that you've got to solve for. You've been asked for data left, right, and center to redo it and all this stuff. But at the same time, you've got enablement, which is very strategic and it's very thoughtful. It needs time. You can't just drop a skills program in and think you're going to suddenly see the productivity lift the next day, even though that's what everyone wants. It doesn't quite work like that. Sometimes you wish it did. But for me, what was really big is how you start to align these and get these worlds closer together. Because I know it's a long answer, but a point on this, a long point, I should say, but the impact that it had once you do get that alignment, I'm not talking executive alignment, but between the operations and enablement teams.
Yeah. Yep. And Vivian just asked a question about the key to staying concise and effective and leaving the room for space. I think you guys both summed that up nicely. The only other thing I'd add is humans have this tendency to say things like, but also, and then, right? For me, it's always like, stop before that, right? That's where you can leave that space for quiet, for silence, and let people digest, ask their questions from there.
And Matthew, I think, sometimes it's hard. Like I fall foul to this as well, because my brain sometimes moves so fast, right? So, and you're in a room and you've got the exec and you're explaining what's going on, or even your manager, right? Your leader, and you're saying, right, these are the enablement things we want to do. These are the ops systems that we want to bring in. This is the new technology we want to bring in. But sometimes it's so much, right, to consume at once. And that's why I love it. It's taking that moment just to stop, let someone think about it, but also be careful, right? Do things in threes. Don't go land and say, we're going to do these, we want to do these 10 things. It's just, you're never going to do 10 things all at once. You're not going to do them well, even if you tried. Rather focus on 3, maximum 5, and then have the metrics behind that. But I just think for any exec, if you're walking into a room, going with 3 things max. I mean, 3, no more than 5.
Yeah, focus is key around what we're talking about is the strategy to execution gap, and a way to make that gap bigger and basically impossible to jump across is having, like you said, 10 different things you're trying to focus on in a short period of time, because you will do all of them well below average. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather do 3 things above average than I would 10 things below average. Next question on this before we dive into the third topic. You all are running technology companies in the revenue technology space. So let's talk a little bit about technology, systems, and automation, and obviously naturally AI, of course. Technology fit into kind of solving some of these problems, and can it make things worse when it comes to the strategy to execution gap?
I'll let Eli take that one first.
Okay. As a technologist, as an innovator, as a creator, as an entrepreneur, you got to really be clear back to the original topic on what problem you're solving, what metrics and KPIs are critical. You need alignment. So you need that foundationally there, because it doesn't matter how good the system is and how well intentioned you are. If you don't have alignment, then you're going to roll out technology that isn't going to actually hit the mark. I think there are a lot of failed sales enablement implementations out there for the likes of some of the really big players. Gartner says 65 to 70% of sales enablement implementations are failed. Clearly not sales and customers, right? But failed because people are trying to automate the wrong process. They're trying to automate the wrong step in the sales process. They haven't figured out how to nail down and create a true go-to-market alignment. And I think really, I think getting teams to talk, getting teams to figure out, what they should be solving and how they're going to measure it, writing it down, and then choosing a technology partner that's going to be there for you. You'll be able to qualify the various different technology providers out there. Because once you figure that out and you pick the right partner, and that partner needs to have an AI-driven first platform, and they need to have examples that map to your specific problems, then you're going to be able to go so fast. So going slow at the beginning, slowing it down, maybe spending, a month, 2 months, analyzing what you're really trying to, and listen, and you're doing your research and you're doing demo requests, and you've got a lot of these salespeople that really want to get the deal done, but like the right ones will appreciate if you're not ready, and they'll help guide you, and they'll provide you with data, with white papers, with benchmarks, and with checklists. That way you can make sure that you're setting this up correctly. And whether you're looking at a RevOps system or sales enablement system or whatever problem you're trying to solve, just know what you're trying to solve first. Like I'll tell my team, that's why I started with, I'm a technologist, I'm an innovator, I love tech, but I tell my team, solve the process first. Let's nail it down without tech. And I learned this back at Salesforce. I remember Frank Van Veenendaal, he was the president, he ran all revenue for many, 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 many decades over there. And I remember I came in there, I'm like, okay, I want to buy this account planning app. He's like, Eli, can we actually get people to understand how to do account planning first? And can you kind of figure out what should be in an account plan first before you go buy something and throw it on a broken process? And so that's my guidance to everyone listening in right now. Werner, what would you say on top of that?
Eli, I think to add to that is that the technology has got to fit into the process, that it's not just a piece of technology to sit on top of the process. It's got to be part of the motion. It's got to be part of the discussions. And that starts to drive the usage. And a lot of the times that, seeing even, myself and myself, be looking at building technology, knowing that this can solve a lot of challenges within organizations just from seeing it over the years but even if people deployed Lative, if it's not built into the workflow and the of how they want to use their Lative, it just becomes something on the shelf. And maybe, part of that stat of why 60-70% of, you mentioned enablement technology.
I'm sure it's the same stat for RevOps systems too.
Exactly. And so it's got to be
disrespect.
Maybe it's not just the process. I think what I just said there is really, it's the workflow. It's got to be part of the workflow. It's got to be how you work. How do you work? And then that technology solving challenges is part of the workflow. That just makes things easier. It saves time, right? At the end of the day, you bring in technology to automate and save time, right? We've got this AI world where it can be a lot more helpful in certain circumstances, sometimes not, depending on where it is. Is it right for the process? Does it fit into the workflow once it's in?
Yeah. Grab a pen, write down the process, open up a Google Doc, whatever your process is for writing it down, and have people read it and get feedback on it and make sure they're aligned on what the steps are that you're trying to automate. And then you use the tech and you'll find the best tech solution.
Yeah, and actually, Eli, just Mac, before we carry on, I think it's just something that brings me back to Sage, what we did actually with my co-founder, Laura Tultosa. We met at Sage and then found Lative. But one of the things we did was we mapped the processes. It is a very painful exercise and no one wants to do it. But you'll find how few organizations have actually gone and looked at their process and actually said, let's just do a map. Exactly to your point, right? Just write it down. This is the sales funnel. These are the stages we've got. Well, what do we do in each of the stages? Great. This is the account plan. This is what we do. This is the enablement whatever the technology is. This is the content management solution. How we're using that. And once you map that all out, it's fascinating to see and go, but that's not how we want to work. We want to work like this. So what you then do is, once you know your current state of your processes, you map the to-be state. How do you want those processes to work? How should it work?
Yeah.
And once you've that clear, then that also makes it much easier to understand what's the best technology, and or even with the technology you've got, how do you then configure it to make that work the way you need? And then what else you need to bring in to make it even more awesome.
So now let's add AI, right?
Yes.
And so, because Matt, you asked the question, and with AI, right? And so you take everything we just talked about, and then you put, an AI driven platform in the mix. The AI advantage happens when you can create an AI experience that's conversational, that's real time, that's context aware, that clean data, clean content, clean process, that has a unified data model, and that ultimately is something that you can trust in their security, right? And so if you think about, you need to have an AI needs to be, what you feed your AI is going to be kind of result in what output you have from AI. So when you're building your LLM and you're working with a partner that's going to deliver to you a private LLM for your business, if you don't have the process and the data and all that stuff I mentioned clean, then you're not going to get the advantage of AI. You're going to wonder, well, why isn't AI working for us? Right. And so it's just next level of automation with AI. And so that's, to answer your question, Matt, it's now even 10x more important because of the integration of AI and Gen AI and soon to be AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, to our business operations as well.
Yeah, like you guys said, one, there's no shortcut. So you can't start with nothing and dump a product in the mix and assume that that's going to solve your problems. I brought up the Elay example before with our software, right? And we've got countless examples of that. And then the thing that I've said multiple times before is start manual, right? And the way that I always think about that is, again, if you identify a problem. So another issue that folks typically have is they go solution first, then problem. Start with your problem, but then figure out how you can solve that manually. And the way that I frame that for myself to help me is always if I had to come up with a solution to solve this by the end of the day, what would I do? And that's going to involve a spreadsheet, a Google Doc, manual stuff, right? It's not going to involve a deployment of some product, but that allows you to take that next step. And then once you get those things figured out, you can deploy technology in the mix to help you. So one of the questions, Werner, I'll ask you this. Vivian was asking about how to think about maturity model for revenue operations, how to build some of this structure, measure some of these behaviors, tie it back to ROI. Do you have any feedback there? You've been in obviously a bunch of different companies on the ops and enablement side. How should folks think about the revenue operations maturity curve? And is there any sort of model out there that you've used or framework that you've used to kind of think about that and how to move up the curve?
Yes. Yeah. Fortunately, I've been, some of the companies I've been able to get, work with Serious Decisions and Forrester and Gartner. And so I've got nice maturity models that you can use. But I think sometimes you just got to bring it back to basics, right? That what have you got? What's your capabilities? What can we do? What do we actually have in our tech stack to operate under? And it's doing that assessment, but doing it, being real about it, and not pretending that it looks amazing and everything's fine, because a lot of the times it's not when you dig into it. I'm happy to share with you some of the models I've used before for on the maturity side, and get that across to you. No issue at all. So just to help you. I think if I'm hearing that right, some of the issues with implementing a new tech stack as well, take it piece by piece. There's a lot to do, but also have a vision of what you want it to look like at the end. Have an idea. That's why the end states are so important, because you've got to know where you're headed. What does this need to look like? And is it aligned, of course, where the business strategy is? Generally, you're going to have your horizon 1, 2, and 3. So the company has its strategy out, probably 3 to 5 years. So you've got an idea of the direction of travel of where that needs to be. So what does the tech stack need to look like there? You might not be able to get all of it right now, but at least you can start putting the pieces in. But also, I'm a big believer in piles of 3. Don't do too much. If you're going to be implementing 1 or 2 pieces of tech, get it in, get it right, get it configured right, get people using. Adoption is absolutely key. And if people aren't going to use it, or, if that causes more problems, and then you're trying to bring in another piece of tech to try to solve that, and then it tends to get a bit out of control sometimes. But I do think it's very important to just take things maybe a bit slower. Be very thoughtful about it, have an end state of where you want to get to, and then work towards that. And I'm happy to share some maturity models that I've used in the past.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And so the last bucket or topic I want to get into today is the integration of revenue operations and revenue enablement. So, again, and, we brought up there's sales enablement, revenue enablement. I mean, you all are experts in revenue operations and revenue enablement. Talk a little bit about how those things, I don't know, how are they integrating? Have they always been integrated? Should they have always been integrated, but now we're getting there? Like, how do these RevOps and revenue enablement, how do they interact or act as one, or are they the same? Are they different? I mean, you guys are building products, you're experts in these particular categories. So what's your take?
Werner, who you want me to go? Or
Yeah, so I'll let you take it, and then I'll have you take the first one.
so, I think the go-to-market function, when we look across enablement, marketing, sales, customer success, is becoming more integrated, right? And I think the rise of the CRO, and I believe the revenue enablement and the revenue operations categories, which are both distinct categories, that they come together. And we already see it happening. There are integrations that exist between the likes of revenue ops companies and revenue enablement companies. And I think it's going to accelerate. And the primary reason is RevOps leaders, go-to-market leaders are looking for a more holistic view into what's working and not working, across their business. And they don't want to look at silos of data, and they don't want to have a siloed workflow experience. And now, especially with AI, a unified data experience, a unified workflow experience, conversational across all your systems, I think it's going to become increasingly more. And so what integrations look like, you can start, like, let's, in the theme of picking a problem, right? Let's talk about one of the top problems right now in the industry is pipeline building, prospecting, right? And so, the revenue ops world will help you develop a capacity model, will help you develop a territory model, an account assignment model, and will ultimately present to a salesperson, here are your accounts, and here are your pipeline goals, and here's how you should be prospecting, right? Which is great. The revenue enablement world will then, present to a salesperson, hey, here's some case studies, here's some content. Oh, by the way, here's some digital sales rooms. If you have a target account basis, here's a digital sales room by account with curated content, right? So now you've got this world where a salesperson wakes up, they've got their territory, which is a revenue ops kind of function. They've got their list of accounts, which is revenue ops. And next to the accounts are all the digital sales rooms that's custom curated, hyper-personalized content coming from a revenue enablement system. And so the ultimate benefit is the salesperson has less time trying to figure out how to prospect, less time trying to figure out what content makes sense. And the system knows, here are the personas, here are the contacts, here's the industry profiles, here are the stories, and it just does all that magic for them. Like, that's a very real integration that is currently happening between revenue enablement and revenue ops. That's one use case, which I love, because I love coming up for ways to make reps more efficient, and especially around pipeline building. Werner, we've talked about many more. You can probably share one as well.
I go to productivity and skills training, right? So, again, foundational to Lative is one of the reasons was we want to say, what is the current productivity of the sales team? And so we know if we know what the teams are performing at, right, be by dimension. So let's take verticals always one. Well, let's take a new business team, right? And you see the productivity of the new business team. You're saying, right, this is what each salesperson's generating, like 200K a year or 250, whatever it might be. And you go, well, we need to get that to 300. So we're going to drop in a value selling program or whatever it might be, or it might be negotiating skills, or Elay, to your point, maybe it needs to be more, I think of Barry Ryan's strategy, but like discovery or qualification, open-ended questions, it might be those pieces, right? But once you start tying those together, you can say, okay, well, did the productivity start to increase when we had these programs come in? And do our new business reps now hit 300K? Because ultimately what's going to increase your productivity is the enablement activity that happens. You can do absolutely system integrations and speed things up in your systems, but the biggest increases will come from the enablement strategy and programs.
Yeah.
And generally, I remember Chris Hine at Citrix used to ask me and say, you need to give me a 10% lift without spending anything additional and enable stuff. Why? Because the team should be 10% better year on year. You have an part of my RevOps team was enablement, and the enablement team should be driving that internally. But I need 20% from you. I'll fund you for the other 10%. And how are you going to do that? And that's where you got to be really thoughtful about what those programs are. So that's why I always tied it to productivity. If you need that lift of 20% or 25% lift in productivity, well, then what's the skills programs that you put in behind it, or even lead into onboarding programs, right? You've got new hire onboarding programs. How fast do salespeople ramp? For enablement, it's absolutely fundamental to know what does someone generate in month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, so that you understand what onboarding programs need to look like. So Matt, but for me, they need to be tightly integrated, because how a person enters and comes into that business requires a lot of technology, not just with RevOps, but across the business. And then they're going to be, immersed into, generally a 3 to 6 month period on average of how they need to be onboarded. Where's the onboarding program? What does that program look like? Where's all the learning content? Where's all the assets that they need to be able to go get to that? So for me, they absolutely go hand in hand. And I know, Eli, we're fortunate. We just spent quite a lot of time working on this at Sage, but it really did. Once you get this right, it drives incredible results.
No, absolutely. I think it's, listen, you've got, the one point I want to add, Matt, and then curious to hear your perspective as you're listening to us talk. The one point I want to add is, like, the analysts, the Gartners and the Forresters, they're saying, 26, 27 is when you can expect full-on integration. I think it's going to happen faster because I can see it already, and there's a hunger for it. There's an appetite for it, and the use cases are real, right? And they're driving real efficiency, and AI is helping because you've got all this data. You've got CRM data, you've got, compensation data, you've got attainment data, you've got conversational intelligence data, and you've got all this content, sales content, sales plays, playbooks, competitive battle cards, training, and Gen AI can just instantly match it all up and drive real efficiency for the business.
And actually, sorry, Matt.
No, what were we going to add to that, Werner?
No, I was getting, because I just then you start thinking about capacity planning, right, for the sales organization, and how does that need to look, and what's the learning path going to look like to be able to handle all the capacity that's coming in, and how do you innovate the existing sales team to be delivering at a higher productivity? Because that's what learning skills. You're not going to just bring someone and put them in an onboarding program and don't do any more enablement, right? There's the whole skills uplift that needs to happen. So, and that's driven by learning path. I agree with you. This has happened much faster. I mean, we both have built technologies that fit quite closely together, and it all came from this idea that it does become one in the future, because they need to operate hand in hand, especially with the way the world's going. And
you've been really focused on some of the skills and the ramping use cases. Like, Matt and everyone listening, you're so right. The intersection is the digital sales room. And the digital sales room is where you can go deep into the funnel and grab buyer engagement data. That buyer engagement data is critical to the forecast. It's critical to capacity planning. It's critical to marketing. I look at the functionality being developed by RevOps companies and rev enablement companies, and everyone's building some form of a digital sales room. That's where I think these worlds start coming together and become increasingly intertwined. That's my point of view. We'll see how it shakes out.
Yeah. So as I was listening to you guys, I think the thing that kind of jumped out to me, again, we've been talking a lot on this strategy to execution gap. Big part of the planning process that every operator goes through is developing metrics, KPIs on how we're going to get there, right? So we talk about, like, we've got like this many reps. This is what their attainment will be. We'll hire this many people. They'll ramp this quickly. All of that stuff is how we'll get to this new business goal that we have, right? And you perform, you see some results, you compare back to that. You're like, guess what? We didn't hit our target. It's like, people didn't hit their quota or their attainment levels that we thought. Our new reps maybe didn't ramp as fast, or, there was turnover, or we didn't hire quickly enough. And it's like, why'd that happen? It's like, I don't know. The enablement piece that we just talked about is a good way to help close that gap, right? If you think about RevOps and all of the inputs that go into those plans that you put together, those metrics, those KPIs, right? How you enable your sales team, for example, or your customer success team, whoever it is, right, that's interacting with prospects and CS, that's essentially the effectiveness aspect of the inputs into your system that are going to ultimately drive the output. So that was a big part for me of like, hey, if you want to focus on how you can close that we're talking about, is like invest or focus on enablement, because that can be a huge value driver here. Yeah. For folks in RevOps who are listening, what would be one piece of advice that you would give them?
We've said it a few times here, just make crystal clear, like make sure you and your team, all the stakeholders have crystal clear clarity on what specific problems you're trying to solve. Write them down and make sure that everyone's aligned on what success looks like. That to me is the most critical thing, Matt and Werner.
Yeah. And what about you, Werner? What would be the one thing that you would tell every operator to go out and do today?
I think once those problems, you've identified that as being very clear on how you're going to solve them, and keeping it to 3. It's not trying to solve 10 things at once. Prioritization is absolutely fundamental. It's probably, my top thing that needs to be, and it's hard. Prioritization is not easy, because some things are going to have to not be done, and it's going to impact people, unfortunately. But you've got to place your bets and just assume that, and not assume metrics, and make sure you prioritize. But it's absolutely key, because that gets the alignment. Then you get alignment with your KPIs. Everything then starts to fall into place, and then everyone gets behind that, and you execute against that.
It's so hard to say no.
Yes.
I've had to learn over the years. RevOps leaders, you can't. You've got to say no.
Yeah. Well, Laura dropped a nice little joke. She said, "There's no gap between our webinar strategy and execution." Very well done. We need Laura. That is awesome. My dang joke radar is like peak right now. So thank you all for attending. Werner and Elay, thank you very much for dropping some knowledge on everybody. But that's all I got for you all. So we'll see you all at the next one.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.